Hello and welcome to Chile Talk. I am Neil Davidson in Buenos Aires.
And I'm Pete Lee in Valparaíso.
So bringing this back again, this nice little international angle to our presentations. In our last little effort, which was a short comparison and rather rambling comparison between Chile and Argentina on every conceivable level, we said that we would next look at the forthcoming elections in Chile. And that's what we're going to do right now.
Well, actually, we're going to skip an election because we've got a very interesting election coming up in a couple of weeks on the 11th of April, which is an election involving, among other things, selecting the representatives for the Constitutional Convention that will attempt to draft a new constitution for the country. But I thought to contextualize that, we might talk about another story arc, which will be informed by the results of the other election, of the Constitutional Convention election, if it happens, because it may be postponed, which is the presidential election coming up at the end of the year. And this presidential election is quite extraordinarily interesting.
Just one, so just for the sake of completeness, there's simultaneously going to be a presidential election and elections for Congress. They're going to be deputies, congressmen elected, various things like that. So it's a pretty enormous election, but we're interested really in the kind of headlines, aren't we, here at the moment, in the presidential candidates?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I've noticed that there is a television program here in Chile, which is called Mentiras Verdaderas, True Lies, where one of the concepts is they get declared presidential candidates to come on and they ask them to go through each of the other candidates. And of course, the candidates very artfully refer to their counterparts, depending on whether they might have to work with them closely in the future or whether they are their sworn enemies, and discuss the qualities that the others have. It's a rather lovely concept.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You must have learned a lot about their characters in the course of watching these debates.
Absolutely, I love them all. The ones that I've seen, I really enjoy them. I find them very entertaining. Whether they'll have the capacity, any of the ones that I've seen will have the capacity to put together a functional presidential program and manage to keep the congressional system somehow working to advance such a program, remains to be seen, because most of them don't seem to talk very much about policies yet. They're kind of calling each other's bluff and not announcing their policies, not taking risks on that front.
I see. Well, I suppose it is still over 7 months away, and they're just being cautious, as politicians no doubt should. So just by way of comparison, we do at present, with President Piñera, you consider have a pretty functional government, right? That's kind of reasonably professionally organized.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting way to put it. There are so many problems in Chile, and there is a fairly obstructionist Congress. There often has been a fairly obstructionist Congress for the past, 10 years or so. And in terms of managing things, they don't seem to be particularly bad, but neither are they particularly good. And they're really, as I believe you've commented before, they're really dependent on how well the economy is going, how well trade is going, how much copper is being bought by China. And it looks like China has started to buy copper again. So if the economy starts to go better, certainly a Piñera government looks better, and a government from the other side of politics, from the centre or the centre-left, also functions a lot better with the economy in a better state.
Right, everybody benefits from having money to spend and sort of employment and stuff. So essentially, the current government is really quite a technocratic one, isn't it? I mean, that was what it wants to be. And they had this social estallido, which we've often mentioned. I suppose it's the bursting out of some pressure that's been contained too long. I suppose that's the kind of closest translation, really. They've essentially been reacting, haven't they, to this? I mean, they had no plans to change society in any way, really, at all, did they? They just wanted to like run it. They just wanted to run things well, didn't they?
Yeah, just trying to get by. Chilean technocracy is a proud tradition going back really to the colonial era. They had some excellent technocrats like Ambrosio O'Higgins. A lot of the greatest presidents in Chilean history have been real technocrats. They've had a real eye for detail. Chile's quite good. The story of Chile coming from being an obscure Spanish colony to being really the earliest former Spanish colony to become an organized state has a lot to do with what we now call technocracy. In the 1990s, the technocratic prowess of the government coming out of the military government that lasted until 1990 was very, very impressive, and their achievements were remarkable. Reducing poverty, putting an end to child malnutrition for good, which Chile had already made progress in, and containing inflation to a normal inflation band of
so quite an honourable tradition, really, which this whole these new demands came along and upset, really.
Yes,
with this more political, essentially having to be more political, less technocratic is what it's all about, isn't it now?
Yes, I mean, I must say that the right wing of politics, and we usually consider Chile to be perhaps the most consistent with the Anglo and European concept of right and left within the Latin American states. The right wing that Piñera comes from is possibly a little lower on technocratic talent than the centre was, but there's not a lot of sign of renewal of talent in the centre, or the centre left as it often calls itself. So there's a talent shortage on the technocratic front, but they are trying.
Okay, I mean, what there's no shortage of, I think, is political parties and presidential candidates, though they are banding up a bit together, aren't they, somewhat? I mean, on the left, I think there was a plan, wasn't there, to have one candidate representing a pretty broad spectrum of the left, which didn't work out, did it?
No.
But yeah, you do tell us about that. I mean, because we've ended up with some weird groupings called like apruebo dignidad, I approve of dignity, and so these names that are kind of concoctions that you get two groupings with different names, and one contains the word apruebo and one contains the word dignity, whatever, and you end up with this kind of Frankenstein monster called I approve of dignity. So we need an expert to talk us through all this, and you're the nursing we've got.
Well, the most hilarious thing about Chilean sloganeering is, of course, how Catholic it is. They love their abstract concepts. They love the social. They love dignity, notwithstanding the fact that the terrible abusive cult run by a Nazi immigrant was called Colonia Dignidad.
The dignity colony. It should have unfortunate associations, but the power of the word is such that anything like that is just brushed aside, isn't it? The word is a steamroller. The word is a steamroller that will just keep on going.
Chileans have adopted it, and there was an indigenous Mexican woman who popularized the phrase. What was the phrase? It was something about "let there be dignity, until there be dignity, until there be made dignity." I think is a translation of a phrase that she popularized, perhaps here on YouTube. And a lot of Chileans adopted that as a slogan. I don't know how it was installed in the vocabulary, and they renamed one of the large, traffic roundabouts, Piccadilly Circus style thing. They named it Plaza Dignidad.
Right, Dignity Square. That's right, of course. It's funny, isn't it? And I've never had anybody really try and define what dignity is, but it's just something everybody kind of knows instinctively, and they want it, don't they? And they never get it.
Well, it's such a wonderful word, you know. I mean, it comes from this Roman classical notion of your just desserts. Really, it's the same thing as, it's a more strict version of merit, really, isn't it? Yeah. What is your weighted portion? That's what it sort of means.
Well, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way. I was just, to be quite honest, converting it into the English word dignity. But sure, what you're saying makes a lot more sense. It actually means something then. It actually means like to each what they deserve, kind of thing,
Well, yes. I mean, you can certainly imagine coming out of World War II, what they were thinking when they came up with things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They wanted to come up with these God words that could be explained in what became known as the Third World and could be readily understood. And of course, I think the Catholic Church and its traditions had a great influence on that. So we come up with these big, empty, abstract concepts that are somehow comforting.
That's right. They really have sunk in. They really have sunk in Latin America. Okay, let's get to the nitty gritty, shall we? So, who are roughly how many candidates are there? Do we think there will be? Because we're not quite sure yet.
Yeah, we're not sure how many they'll end up with, but there seem to be about around a dozen, either fully declared or threatening to declare their candidacies. There have been a couple of candidacies that were declared but disappeared. The most spectacular one being from Óscar Landerretche, who is an economist, a technocrat, a very good technocrat, and a bit of a thinker, a bit of an ideas person. I quite like him. But he didn't manage to break through in the Socialist Party star system. Maybe he will in future years. I think he'd probably make a really good president. But we have basically three blocs. Chile is somewhat want to have three blocs. And at the moment, we usually think of there being a left, a centre left, and what calls itself a centre right, which goes all the way to quite a bit right. Those are the three sort of mainstream blocs. And the left isn't that mainstream. So
I see. The centre left is mainstream, but the actual left is quite would slightly probably surprise us in kind of Britain or Australia, whatever, with some of its thinking.
Some of it's a very colourful grouping. Probably something like the Greens movement in places like Britain and Australia would be most comparable to the left. As far as it exists in Chile. Of course, it does have a communist party. It has several communist parties, but it has one fairly mainstream communist party that has an interesting cachet for having been banned a couple of times in its history, and of course, for suffering during the long military dictatorship of Pinochet. But in terms of the content that it has, it doesn't have many. They're certainly not consistent. They're certainly not consistent with communism as even something like Euro-communism from Italy or France. It's not consistent with that. It's simply a sort of family business for politicians.
I see. And do they have their own candidate, or have they teamed up with somebody else?
Very much do. They very much do. And we should start in this discussion, I think, coming from this left group. And the Communist Party have their candidate, which is Daniel Jadue. Jadue. His family is of Palestinian heritage. Both of his parents had the same surname. They both descended from the same village in what is now the West Bank, I believe, in Palestine. And he, like a lot of politicians, yes, is of Levantine descent. We call them Arabs. They're Arabic-speaking peoples from the Levant. And he is currently the mayor of Recoleta, which is a traditional sort of rag trade and market area.
A traditionally Palestinian area, isn't it? Well, why don't you just perhaps mention a bit more about that? There are a lot of people of Palestinian descent in Chile. I think I've read 400,000 or something. We mentioned this before. It's supposed to be the biggest diaspora, the biggest Palestinian diaspora, I think.
Yes, and as I've published in a couple of articles, it's not actually true, but people repeat that datum so often that a lot of Chileans believe it.
The 400,000 or the biggest diaspora, or both?
The biggest Palestinian diaspora outside the Middle East, or the biggest one, even the biggest one in South America. It's simply not true. What is interesting in Chile is that the people who came from places in the Levant, basically Christians leaving the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, so coming from Syria, Lebanon, and also mandatory Palestine, many of them came to identify as Palestinians, because there was some cachet attached to that. Nobody knew, but every Catholic Christian knew that there is such a thing as Palestine because it's mentioned in the Gospels. So as a consequence, there's a football club called Palestino, and many people of Levantine descent somehow identify as Palestinians. Not all of them do. Some of them identify as Syrios. That's certainly considered more, maybe even more high-end. There's a high-end club for Syrians in Santiago. Others identify as Arabs. Of course, they wouldn't identify as Arabs in where they came from, because Arabs mean people from Arabia, or Bedouins, and they're not Bedouins. They're people descended from the Christians in those places.
That's right, the Maronite Christians. And of course, the Chileans, like the Argentinians, simply call the whole lot of them Turks, because their ancestors arrived carrying Ottoman Empire passports.
Yes, they certainly originally did. Not anymore, but they originally did. Yes.
That's right. So this candidate whose name we've forgotten, Daniel
Jadue. He seems to be fairly popular with people. He's got a nice proletarian touch. There are attempts to associate him with massive fraud, having to do with the lighting of the streets and other sources of fraud. Who knows? I mean, that would really need to be looked into. Basically, most of the politicians in Chile, as everywhere in South America, like to accuse each other of fraud, and usually are proved right, and then the accusers are proven to be
fraudulent in their turn. Okay, should we run fairly quickly through the people who are obviously not going to win anyway?
Yeah, well, we should move a bit quicker because this is becoming a sprawling epic. But another fantastic candidate, Jadue, is actually polling the best in some of the polls at the moment.
So I vaguely assumed he wasn't going to win, but perhaps he will win. Okay.
No, he's not going to win, but the opinion polling in South America is very, very primitive and very poor. So when there are a lot of candidates, it's not very accurate. It's simply what the people who are being asked, simply the names that they've heard of will be the names that they'll say are the people they might vote for. And it becomes a little bit more scientific as they get closer to the elections. But they've heard of him because he seems to be quite a character. And even more so, they've heard of Pamela Jiles, who is a kind of Oprah, or a bit sub Oprah, Ricky Lake style television personality. She's very got a very feisty personality, and she kind of, her political positioning seems to be, she is actually an active deputy in the Congress. Her political positioning seems to be daring anyone to consider her to be unqualified.
I see. Just right. I mean, for a sitting deputy to have their own TV show is well, it seems. I suppose it seems rather Latin. I suppose Latin is the word for it, isn't it?
Yeah. I don't think her show's running at the moment. I don't know. I don't watch television. I only watch a bit of YouTube. Chilean television is absolutely execrable. It is almost impossible to watch.
It is. I've tried to sit through. I mean, we're supposed to be living in an age of short attention spans. Now I thought I had a reasonably long attention span. I read heavy books, whatever, but I cannot watch the Chilean news. They will take an event, and because they've gone to the trouble of sending a journalist there, I think simply for that reason, they will cover a robbery or something for half an hour on the news. And I've tried to sit through it, and I just cannot do it, and I've had to turn it off.
Yeah, it's terrible. Well, I mean, she's polling quite well because she's got quite a bit of name recognition. Jiles, she's the sort of person that some people say, I'm leaving the country if she becomes president. And other people say, why shouldn't she be president? She's got a bit of personality, a bit of feist. But I don't think if it comes down to a head-to-head runoff, which is how things work eventually, I don't think she'd be able to carry much of the vote. I don't think people would turn out to vote for her. So I'm willing to consider her to be not that dangerous a candidate. And many Chilean, particularly right-wingers, are very worried that these populist sort of characters could carry a vote. I don't think it's the case. Voting isn't compulsory in Chile, and I think her natural clientele doesn't vote anymore.
That's right. And there is something rather strange about the way that, since Allende, maybe partly clearly it is fear of another dictatorship, but only in part, it is a bit strange that poor Chileans haven't voted for somebody who promises them the earth. It's rather odd, but at the same time, the people coming forward now don't really promise the earth very convincingly, do they? So
no.
Very threatening.
No, Chileans are skeptical of that. They don't seem particularly susceptible to wholesale populism. Little bits of populism, such as paying out bonuses, throwing money out of a helicopter sort of stuff, does appeal to Chileans. As long as you tell them this is the good middle class welfare we're giving you. They don't accuse you of being poor. They might like that. As long as they don't insult you, they might go with your populism. But that's the reason in Chile we always talk about the poor people who might vote. We now call them the middle class. That's the official name for the poor people who might vote. So politicians love talking about the middle class.
And the others don't get a mention because they're not going to vote.
They're the most vulnerable, and they're dangerous because they might rob you. So the most vulnerable and the middle class are these two sort of patronized groups.
Of what in other countries might be called the poor.
Yes, yes, and in fact they're not poor. They do have enough money. They have plenty of stuff, but on a cultural level, yes, they're not as cultured as a middle class would be in the United States or in Britain, or the connotations of a bourgeoisie. They're not a bourgeoisie, let's say.
Certainly not. All right, so we have Pamela Jiles, not too dangerous probably. Who else might you like to mention to us?
Well, Gabriel Boric is the youth candidate from the left. He comes from the Frente Amplio tradition, the broad front. There was a very successful centre-left coalition in Uruguay, led by the former communist guerrilla José Mujica, who was a very old president. He was in his 80s. And he was a very sensible president. Of course, Uruguay is not the hardest country to run. It's a small country with under 4 million people. I think closer to 3 million people. And simply by not doing what Argentina does, it is possible to formulate a sensible national policy for such a small sort of city-state. So he was much loved. He was a Guardian favorite. They absolutely loved him to bits. They loved him even more than they love Evo Morales, who claims to be the first. He claims to be the first indigenous president of Bolivia, which of course is of much amusement in Bolivia, where the definition of being indigenous is the ability to speak an indigenous language, which Evo possibly can't do.
Oh, I didn't know about this.
And quite a lot of more phenotypically whitish Bolivian presidents have been able to speak Quechua and or Aymara very well. So would qualify as indigenous by that measure, despite not being as indigenous looking as Evo obviously is.
How interesting. So the Bolivians are not yet buying into our Western identity politics that are based on race. They're still like going with their own like sort of definitions.
Certainly not Evo's enemies. Evo's enemies don't buy into that. But he does get a bit of international cachet, and he's a wonderful, wonderful retail politician as well. He really knows how to sell things, and I think Bolivians are prouder of themselves for the way that Evo ran his particular populism, his particular schemes. Frente Amplio is not a leftist movement of the quality of Evo Morales' Movimiento Socialismo, the movement towards socialism in Bolivia, or Mujica's Frente Amplio in Uruguay. Frente Amplio came out of the student movement. The tertiary student movement really came to a head in around 2011, and there was.
I was going to say that Gabriel Boric has been the youth candidate for as long as I can remember.
He's a rather seasoned enfant terrible. He's a bit like he'll probably be a bit like Philip Roth, you know, in the United States. Jewish American imaginary. He'll die an enfant terrible. That's just the way it is. And probably Salvador Allende was similar, you know, in his time, or Marmaduke Groep. There are such characters, and he's a bit of a talker. He's from Magallanes in the far south. He's obviously got a Croatian surname. A lot of Croatian immigrants moved to the far south of Chile to basically work on the sheep farms, which were mostly owned by Scots and Welsh settlers, and to keep hold of that particular part of Chile, because the part between that and central Chile was not really settled, and to keep the Argentines out, and to make sure it wasn't absorbed into any possible Mapuche state, which was always hoped for by some people, and certainly appeared on maps. So he comes from this far south community that has interesting qualities, and is obviously a very tough people, very interesting people, very prestigious, I think, in the Chilean imaginary. And he's a good talker. He's an interesting guy, but the problem with Frente Amplio is they had zero policies. They were completely incapable of formulating any policies, and the only thing they really had to offer is what a lot of sort of left-leaning people from privileged backgrounds from the ruling class, essentially, in Chile. We call them pipiolos. Pissers is the traditional term. That's the term that really came out of the 1820s, really, in the organization of the state. The Pipiola party were defeated in the first civil war in Chile in 1829, 1830 by the bigwigs, the Pelucones. And the Pelucones won rather decisively. And the Pipiolas were influenced by they had a lot of British influence. They were sort of, you know, modernizers and a lot of Masonic influence as well. And they were defeated. And every so often, something like the Pipiolos turns up. The Socialist Party, when it started out, was a bit like that. The Radical Party back in the 1860s was a bit like that. They were the ankle biters. They were people from the privileged class who pretended to represent the true interests of the people. Without
I see. So you're saying they're not really quite serious, that they don't have substance. They just are some kind of provocateurs or like spoilt.
Yes.
Because
they have.
It seems, you know, it does seem strange to have, for a kind of a left-wing party coming out of a student movement, to have no policies at a time when, you know, there's just been this huge upheaval, people demanding change. They would seem to be perfectly positioned, right, if they had policies.
Yeah, well, they seem to be very talented at retail politics, but unfortunately, part of their position was that there's too much neoliberalism and technocracy, and that's why we're not going to show any ability, any technocratic capacity, because that's bad. That's clearly bad. We are good, honest, content-free left-wingers with symbolism and so on. So anyway, that's why you can't take Frente Amplio seriously. And that's why, yeah, you shouldn't take them seriously, but maybe, you know, they could broker some sort of deal if they're needed enough by the traditional centre, which calls itself the centre-left, which we can move on to now. I wouldn't say any of those left candidates are capable of carrying much vote in a runoff, of getting many people to turn up in a vote. Now, in the centre, we have the traditional, what we often call the former Concertación, because the tolerated official opposition to Pinochet, because Pinochet did not allow political parties of any kind, including the political parties that were sympathetic to him, recognition until the late 1980s, when there was going to be a return to elected rule.
To be a plebiscite, yeah.
Yeah. So basically, the tolerated centre organised itself as what is called the Concertación for democracy, which is a French term. It's a French concept of a broad, essentially centrist orientation that identifies as centre-left. And Chile is the only place in the world where the Christian Democrats are considered to be left of centre. There is essentially no centre, and this classic centre-right party, the centre-right party everywhere in continental Europe,
is right of centre, and in Chile they've managed to like position themselves in this way. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So, but who? I mean, who has got policies? I mean, you know, who's got some genuine, solid policy for like something new, apart from let's have a new constitution? You know.
Well, let's go through the centre. There is no policies on offer here. The current candidates who are clearly in the game, you would have to say, are coming from the Socialist Party, so the party of Salvador Allende and Michelle Bachelet. We have the Bachelet associate, Paula Narvaez. She was the spokesperson, which seems to be a very important job in Chile. That's considered to be a serious sort of political post. It's just a local eccentricity. And she...
I think the reason probably is because they spend so much time, their face gets so much time on television because of this Chilean form of journalism, which consists in pointing a camera at somebody and letting them talk for half an hour on the primetime news. That person gets a lot of exposure, which makes them, I think, seem to be a serious person. Yes. And makes the job desirable for somebody ambitious.
Yes. Well, and as far as we can tell, Paula Narvaez is not all that ambitious. She's just been put forward by the Politburo of the Socialist Party as their candidate backed by women, because there's been a strong feminist wave in the aesthetics all around the world, and particularly here in Latin America. And she must be a feminist because she's a woman. And further proof of that is that she was the spokesperson in the previous female-led government of Michelle Bachelet. And she's been working for Michelle Bachelet, who works apparently very successfully in the United Nations organization. She's running human rights now. She was running UN Women. Nobody knows what that entails, but she's doing it. She's doing it. And Paula Narvaez was working for her.
Perhaps they should give her the European Union next, you know, considering what Ursula von der Leyen's, you know, what a message they could.
I wouldn't be surprised if China recruits her to be the foreign minister or something, because she is so very talented. Just incredible. And the last time she came in, despite the fact that Michelle Bachelet, this is, you know, hadn't performed so well during her government, she was still quite popular. She's quite a popular sort of grandmother figure. And the second time she was president, they really kept her locked up. And she flew back from New York to be the candidate, I think, just for the last sort of 6 or 7 weeks to run her campaign. And that was coming on the back of the first Sebastián Piñera government, which was extremely unpopular and had brought about a large amount of protesting, partly because all of the groups that were protesting during the Concertación years, which lasted from 1990 to 2010, already had all of the syndicates or the trade unions and the student unions were part of the system. They were part of the system, so anyone with a political ambition couldn't really protest against the government. The only big protest came from the school kids. You couldn't do it if you were doing it at the
so everybody else had been co-opted. I hadn't quite thought of it in those terms. Interesting.
Yes.
So anyway, so this Councillor Narvaez, she is basically just a continuation of this kind of grouping that's been the main centre-left grouping forever, and just kind of more of the same, I suppose. I mean, I can never quite remember what they stood for originally. But whatever it was, I suppose she stands for that.
Well, I guess peace and reconciliation they were about in the 1990s, and concrete results.
Yeah.
And they achieved that very convincingly. And, you know, that maybe retrospectively that isn't enough for some people's imagination of what they should have been doing under military supervision in the 1990s.
Or looking ahead, I suppose, because as I say, we've had this great upheaval, people obviously demanding something new, but not really knowing what they're demanding, and nobody seems to know what to offer them either. And so it all comes down to, let's have a new constitution, and the whole thing seems to have been booted along really to that.
Yes, that seems to be the linchpin that's going to put everything back in place, or the foundation stone that's going to put everything back in place. It's a terrifying prospect.
Or it might just be a huge pile of sand that helpfully absorbs all the surplus energy that people seem to have.
Yes. Yes, well, we'll have to revisit the constitutions again in another presentation, but Paula Narvaez is far from the decided centrist candidate, and she's been performing so badly in the media, despite being chosen for her speaking skills. She has so much difficulty connecting ideas to speaking. She speaks in almost pure platitude, with a little bit of self-righteousness, I guess, as well, which is always attractive. And that's not really working. And she's been getting some mauling from journalists, including the sister of the the Christian Democrat candidate, whose name is Jimena Rincon, and her sister, Monica Rincon, mauled Paula Narvaez, cornered her on a television program, and it's looking very, very bad for Narvaez.
It's a small world, isn't it? It's a small world. Okay.
Yes.
So perhaps not a shoo-in. Okay, we should probably move fairly swiftly on and wrap up.
Yeah, well, I better get through a few more possibilities here in the centre, because there's also coming from the Party for Democracy, which is a Ricardo Lagos personality cult. We have a dinosaur, not as dinosaur as Ricardo Lagos, but I think he's about 73, Heraldo Muñoz. Mm-hmm. He's threatening to become the candidate. He's a bit like Joe Biden. He's ancient, and we're just not sure. We're not sure what he can do. Jimena Rincon comes from the Christian Democrats, whose voter base is very reliable, but it's only 10% of the population. They're ancient, kind of somewhat progressive Catholics, you know, sort of Vatican II sort of people. A very reliable vote, but average age, you know, 75. Not a very viable platform. The two presidents who came after Pinochet were both Christian Democrats, and that's sort of when the Christian Democrat movement basically disappeared. They were just too moderate. They were too moderate. They were too, as we classically say, they were neither chicha, nor lemonade.
Mm-hmm. Neither fish nor flesh. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, they were very, 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 very yellow. And so I don't think a viable candidate can come from there. There's even talk from the Radical Party, and the Radical Party rose, I think, about 1860 out of the sort of Anglophile Masonic tradition, like the Radical Party, the Radical Union. There had been various radical parties in Argentina, including the Alfonsín was the last one in the 80s. He had a sort of successful post-dictatorship government, which was then very unsuccessful with inflation, which is a typical story in Argentina. He had everybody feeling okay, and then the economy went to hell. The radical tradition in Chile is also this sort of respectable middle class tradition, and they don't really have much capacity to find candidates, but they borrowed a television personality in Alejandro Guillier for the last time against Piñera in 2017.
That's right.
And he seemed to have, you know, a little bit of practice as a television personality, or a journalist, as we call them in Chile. And when it came to the debate against Piñera, who can barely speak, he's famous for barely being able to speak. A very intelligent person, Sebastián Piñera, but public speaking is not his thing. He misspeaks all the time. Even against Piñera, Guillier could not debate. And there was a very clear sign that he didn't want to win the presidency.
And he just came across as slightly weird, really, didn't he, on the whole?
He was hopeless. I mean, somebody whose only sort of saving grace should have been that he's a
polished, whatever, polished speaker, whatever.
He couldn't execute that in the debate, and it was very depressing. Okay. There's actually talk of resurrecting him now that the centre doesn't look like being able to find a viable candidate, which would be an hilarious possibility. And then in the centre as well, we also have Marco Enriquez Ominami, who's an inveterate candidate. He will probably run again because he always runs, and he's sort of his own personality cult. You know, he would attract maybe 5% of the vote. He's very enthusiastic, very nice guy. There's also, technically speaking, Andres Velasco, who's currently working as a dean at the London School of Economics. He's a classic technocrat guy who, like a lot of classic technocrats, has tried to establish a new centrist party called Ciudadanos, Citizens.
That's right. That's right.
I don't think.
Like
I don't think. Yeah. So that's the mess in the centre. I can't see anyone coming through, but it may yet happen because, of course, at the moment we have centre-right government, a Chile Vamos government. Let's Go Chile is the name of the coalition, which is a very disciplined coalition. They seem to be quite disciplined, and they're quite well placed for the Constitutional Convention, which is coming up, as opposed to the centre and the left. They've actually been able to formulate lists for people to vote. So people are going to be able to know that they're voting for the centre-right candidate according to the list. It's an absolute mess. There's about 15 lists or 11 lists from the centre and the left. So Chile Vamos might be too organised for their own good, because they might do too well in the Constitutional Convention, which will lead to accusations of being overrepresented.
I see.
Only appealing to, you know, a natural third of the people. If they end up getting half the seats at the convention, people will be saying, why are they overrepresented? Well, they're overrepresented because they ran a better campaign. They understood how to run the campaign. And that could turn the voters against them in the presidential election.
I see. Feeling it was they've sort of hit below the belt, really, by running such a good campaign. Or by being so organised.
That's a possibility. So I'll now have to very quickly get through the centre-right or right. Okay, probably most centre-most, we have Sebastián Piñera, who's running as an independent. He came originally from the Christian Democrat movement. He was a young Christian Democrat aspirant, but he's an apostate, and he's joined the centre-right, which is, you know, the sort of thing that probably Angela Merkel would do if she was in Chile. And he is backed by some empresarios, which is what we call business people. And that part of the game is fairly opaque, so nobody's sure who's backing him. He was a popular social development minister. Social development is the most popular gig you can have in the economy, because it's come to mean giving bonuses to people, giving handouts to the middle classes.
Okay, so it's like being the Chancellor of the Exchequer in Britain during a time of coronavirus, whatever. That's right.
Yes, you're giving out the money, to the stimulus money, to the middle classes, and you're saying we're right behind the middle classes. We're all for working families and middle classes. So that automatically makes you high profile and popular. And he seems to be quite an interesting guy. Hard to say. I like him. I like all of these candidates. I might sound harsh on them, but I find them to be interesting characters. I can't see him being popular enough, even if the others fall over. He would rely on some of the other candidates falling over to get there.
All right.
Next, we have Evopoli, Political Evolution. Evopoli. This is an interesting party that comes from what we call the gremialist movement, which is a corporatist.
It's kind of syndicalism, what we'd probably call syndicalism in
yes, a Catholic corporatism.
Anyway.
Yeah, something like that. You know, like Franco or that sort of thing.
And that was a big strand in the dictatorship, wasn't it? Developed by Jaime Guzman, which eventually went for the neoliberalism, but syndicalism was a big strand.
Yeah, they were skeptical. Jaime Guzman was a lawyer and politician. He was assassinated in 1991, 1 year into becoming a senator in the democratically elected government. He was assassinated by, you know, far left sort of, you know, you call them posers, but you know, they killed him, so they obviously you know, were dedicated to that. And he was a genius. He was without doubt a genius. I mean, computationally. A very, very smart person who wrote largely wrote the Constitution of 1980 and is something of a hate figure to some people. But whatever you say about him, one thing you cannot doubt is his intellect. Absolutely first-rate intellect in a country that doesn't have many such characters, and really should recognise and love them when they arise. And from gremialism has come his continued party, the UDI, the
Independent Democratic Union.
Yes, which is the biggest party in Chile. It's considered usually to be a right-wing party, started to call itself a centre-right party at some point.
And doesn't strike one as particularly syndicalist, because it's been associated, of course, with this continuing, what we call neoliberalism and so on. Yes,
as well as sort of the military family and the military heritage and law and order and that sort of thing. But it actually has a splinter group that's quite socially liberal. These guys have they've tasted the wind, and they've worked out that things like abortion and gay marriage, they're coming. They're coming, if they're not already here. Those sort of social policies are coming. They're not totally inconsistent with a Catholic worldview. So we may as well indicate that we understand that, and we have this centre-right aesthetic that's called political evolution evopoly. Economically, some of these characters...
Okay, so that's the splinter group from the UDI,
Yeah, they're very, very, what they would call liberal, and what their critics would call neoliberal. They're very, very free enterprise oriented, extremely pure in that passion, perhaps more than the UDI, more than anyone else. But aesthetically, they're quite young oriented. Young, they have quite a youthful sort of aspiration. They're not particularly popular, but they're quite youthful in aspiration.
So they're basically what the Economist newspaper is always looking for, which is people who are kind of economically liberal and socially liberal.
Yes, they would probably get a cover story if they could ever become, if they could ever make it to the presidential runoff. The Economist would be right behind them, But one of perhaps their most prominent leader is Felipe Cast, who is the son of Miguel Cast, who was an important Chicago boy, an important Chicago-trained economist during the Pinochet years, who died of cancer in 1984, I think. Also a very smart person, and he was the son of a German immigrant, a pair of German immigrants, including an SS officer, Michael Kast, who actually introduced casual dining to Chile. He founded the Bavaria casual dining chain and introduced all of this sort of Chileanized German food to central Chile. Quite an interesting character as well, very hardworking man. And yes, his son became an economist, died. Felipe Cast.
Right, and his son is now...
Yes, is a politician. And the candidate for Evopoli is a fairly middle-class looking fellow. That is to say, he doesn't look like a German immigrant. Ignacio Briones, he's a clearly Chilean fellow, and he's Pamela Jiles, the populist sort of Ricky Lake type left-wing candidate, described Briones as very arribista, which doesn't actually mean arribist in Chile, because in Spanish there is a confusion about what that means. Of course, in French that means arriving, but arribista in Spanish is understood to mean towards the top.
Right, arriba meaning up.
Upwards, yeah, someone moving upwards. And there's actually, by extension, there's bajista, going downwards, having an aesthetic of pretending to slumming, you know, a sort of slummer aesthetic. So there's a confusion in a general confusion in Spanish about what arribista means, and certainly I'm sure Pamela Jiles would not understand what it means in France. But her definition of Briones is he's a person who's come up from the ranks. It's quite a racist or pigmentist thing to say, I think.
I see. Yes, he's kind of jumped up, I suppose, would be kind of thing where we're settling his shit.
And no one pays attention to him, so he's not going to win. But I do feel a bit sorry for him because I felt that he was getting bullied. Another middle-class Chilean who's become a very successful politician is Mario Desbordes, who is the head honcho of Renovación Nacional, which is the
other centre-right.
30 years. It's the Chilean nationalist tradition. They're proud of the country. They love the country. They're right wing, but they're quite sensitive to trying to have some sort of electable platform from the centre right. And Mario Desbordes is a former policeman and a former prison guard, gendarme, I believe. And he's very middle class. I believe he comes from San Felipe. It might be Los Andes. Those are two small cities just to the north of Santiago. And I think it's San Felipe that he's from. I might be wrong about that. And he's quite a swarthy fellow. He looks like a Chilean. And he is a talented enough politician, but I think he might look too much like the Chileans for the Chileans to trust him.
I was going to say, this is a fairly recent development, isn't it? Having serious political contenders who actually look Chilean.
Yes.
They do tend to look very European, the people who actually
yes.
Whether because Chileans have feel some kind of deference, I suppose you're saying they do, really, and they don't trust really one of their own. It's like... I
think so. I would say that Sebastián Piñera is probably the most phenotypically Amerindian president since the 1940s, since Aguirre Cerda, Pedro Aguirre Cerda, who was a radical politician trying to represent the middle classes. I would say since then, they've been quite, they've looked more European than they've looked Chilean.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. The Chileans, all the Chileans I've spoken to, I think ever really, have all told me that Chileans are kind of the most dishonest people in the world. And, there are some who will talk up their country, but on the whole, that's what people, they have a very poor self-image or poor image of their compatriots in that way. So one understands why they would not want to elect somebody who appeared to be too archetypically Chilean. You hear the most extraordinary stories. Somebody told me, there's several people who told me that, if you go to Canada, there are posters up everywhere saying, Chileans steal. They can't help it. It's in their nature. The idea of a country like Canada having such posters is, I've never been to Canada, but it's ludicrous. This is all a projection of their own mistrust of their own countrymen, who they consider to be completely dishonest.
Yes, we'll have to do a whole show on that one. But it is extraordinary. I think Chile is not ready for someone as Chilean as Mario Desbordes, and that's his angle. Is I am a real Chilean. Yeah. That's a big part of his image.
And he's probably taking exactly the wrong line, or maybe in 20 years' time they'll be ready for it. But it's probably
exactly. I think for now they're not quite ready for him. Possibly they'll need a more Chilean-looking woman first. Might be more palatable.
Right, possibly that might be a nice way of easing into it. Got it.
Yeah, I think so. Of course, Sebastián Piñera claims to be so Amerindian looking because one of his conquistador ancestors had married an Inca princess. That's his.
Did you say that? I didn't know this. He doesn't even strike me as being particularly Amerindian looking, but I'm not very good at this kind of thing, Oh
yeah, he looks fairly Mapuche, yes. but he's claiming to be of Quechua descent. And of course he is, but he's also of Mapuche descent and African descent, and he just doesn't talk about that. Anyway, Mario dos Bordes is a good retail politician, but not good enough. He's not going to win.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay.
They won't back him. Another possibility is Joaquin Lavín, who is a real... I'm not actually sure how old he is. He's over 70. He's about 70, 71 or 72. And he's been mayor of
Las Condes, right?
Las Condes, which is a traditional barrio alto. That was uptown. That was the good end of town in the 1960s. So when the song Little Boxes was adapted by the great Nueva Canción, which is sort of socially conscious pop music in the Spanish-speaking world, actually originally comes from Franco's Spain, but was largely in Latin America. It was largely organised by Comintern, the circuit. So they had this Nueva Canción music that was terribly socially conscious, and a wonderful singer, Victor Jara, who died in very tragic circumstances. He was basically killed by the military.
He was tortured to death, and
immediately after the military coup in September 1973. He actually did a version of the song Little Boxes in Spanish, which had already been done in Franco's Spain by Salda. Someone Salda, I think, was the version. He did a Chilean version, and because Chile didn't have middle-class suburbs as are being satirized in the song Little Boxes on the hillside, little boxes all the same, he sort of set it in the rich part of town, which was Las Condes at the time, where people were trying to build European-style houses, sort of these kind of... they're kind of like these houses from the parts of Germany that were rebuilt after the war.
It's very dull. I don't know what the architectural inspiration is, but it's very dull. I mean, it makes you wonder why it's one of the best parts of town.
Yes. And his version of Little Boxes satirizes Las Condes, which now is not really the upper end of town, but it's still symbolically sort of considered to be a blue ribbon right-wing seat.
That's right.
Maybe the archetypal mayoralty to win. And the mayor there, and he was the previous mayor, I think, in the early 1990s. Then he became mayor of Santiago, which is sort of a symbolically important mayoralty.
Santiago being the municipality in the centre of Santiago. It's rather like the city of London is what was originally London, in this case, what was originally Santiago, but it's only a small part of Santiago, not the whole city. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and we're about to have an elected governor of the metropolitan region, which will be similar to the sort of who's doing it at the moment? Sajid Khan.
That's right, exactly. Yeah, this what was the Greater London Council and was then turned into a mayoralty covering the whole urban area, as opposed to the Lord Mayor of London, who's just the mayor of the equivalent of this little central bit.
Yes. So that sort of concept, which has happened with a lot of large cities around the world in recent times. Right. So we're moving to that model.
That's right. So Lavín, anyway, so Lavín was mayor of Las Condes, is mayor of Las Condes, and he's actually, he's been quite sort of, he hasn't just run it as a kind of fuddy-duddy right-wing preserve, has he? He's tried to sort of broaden it out a bit.
Yes, he's doing social housing. He's describing himself as a social democrat, which is the traditional, that's usually how the centrists describe themselves, so they can claim to be centre-left. He's described himself as a centre democrat, as a social democrat, and there's no reason to say that he's not any less social democratic than, say, the Concertación was in the 1990s. He's from the Opus Dei group, which is a very
conservative Catholic grouping, but he's reinventing himself. So that's quite an interesting pitch from a pretty well-known face, from a pretty well-known politician.
Well, I mean, I think the Opus Dei movement in general, it's often people in the English-speaking world don't know much about it. Maybe from the Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown or something, but it's associated with these post-authoritarian countries such as Spain. It came from Spain, and throughout Latin America, Opus Dei is an important post-authoritarian organization. It usually has very good universities associated with it.
And a kind of slightly sinister tinge of the kind that was kind of associated with the Jesuits, perhaps in the 19th century. Perhaps Opus Dei's rather taken over that slightly sinister mantle.
Yeah, also very loyal to the Vatican, and nobody knows much about it. It has a mission to the poor, as well as a sort of elitist cachet, and it's the sort of thing that's very, very hard for Anglo people to understand exactly what it is. And he's coming from that tradition. He would be the first known Opus Dei head of government in the world if he wins. And he's been trying to win, for perhaps 30 years. He's run, I think he ran in 2000 or sometime like that.
I see.
Against Lagos, I think, 1999 perhaps. I'm not sure exactly when the last time he ran for president from the centre-right coalition, which is now Chile Vamos. He's an interesting candidate. He'll work with everyone. He wants to be electable. He was or is essentially the owner of a university. Of course, you can't be the owner of a university in Chile. It's against the law. But he, at one point, was one of the kind of effectively shareholders of a holding company that has control over not a particularly prestigious university in Santiago, Universidad de Desarrollo. The prestigious one is called Universidad de los Andes, which is a very, very good openly Opus Dei university, much like Universidad Austral in just outside Buenos Aires in Pilar, which is an extremely good university as well.
Yeah. Okay. Listen, Peter, I think we'd probably better be wrapping up. So I have the feeling this has run on rather long.
Oh, yeah, I've got to get through everyone. Well, anyway, we'll have to talk a bit more about this at some other time. But the other candidate on the right, who may come in and could win, is Evelyn Matei, who is another veteran right-winger. She's officially an independent. I think she's been through both UDI and Renovación Nacional, the parties of Levin and Desbordes. She's a very, very intelligent person. She's currently mayor of Providencia, which styles itself as a somehow slightly more like Palermo in Buenos Aires, a slightly more sophisticated part of inner city part of.
It's well for those who know London, it's Santiago's West End, I suppose, on a smaller scale and whatever. But it's kind of where but it's not, is it? Because I come to think of it, I'm always surprised when I go to Providencia just how kind of sort of really sort of crappy the shops are and stuff. I mean, it's not the West End actually, is it? It's kind of
massively crappy. Apparently, it used to be quite nice. It used to have, back in the days when it was important to have theatres and handsome movie theatres. Apparently, it was very nice.
I think that's it. It was, because it's central, and then you got to the east of it, to the west of it, because everything's back to front. It's a financial district, whatever. Well, it's not really the government district. To the west of it, right? No, that's fair enough. Yeah, to the west of it is a government district and a bit of the little financial district, and there's another financial district, whatever. But let's not get to the east. And so it kind of occupies geographically the area which the West End would kind of occupy, and it did used to have that kind of sort of not elite but reasonably sophisticated kind of image, plus a bit of elitism. But now it's just kind of not much, really, is it?
Well, it was the first suburb. It was the first suburb to be given Comuna status. I think in 1890 something. It was the 120th anniversary. So after the Civil War, it became a sort of planned suburb. Santiago's, and it became the Barrio Alto,
That's right. And the name is still kind of sounds kind of slightly classy somehow, but then you actually look at it and it's not. That's what it is.
No, because it's been rebuilt a couple of times, each time worse and worse. It's currently being, the sort of 1960s, 1950s construction now is being knocked down and being replaced with truly awful things.
Anyway, so Evelyn Matei is currently the mayor of Providencia.
Yeah, she's the mayor. She's
best known for banishing street sellers from the streets, which I have to say was, to me was a very bad. They were so useful, the street sellers. They were the best thing about Providencia, actually. And now they're gone. It's just nothing.
Yeah, well, she has a reputation and an image. I mean, she was often lampooned as a He-Man-like figure because she has blonde hair. And is of largely German descent, and seen as this sort of Teutonic, no-nonsense figure. Very smart woman. Her father was an Air Force general. I think he was the top Air Force general, so probably nominally in the junta. I think there was a nominal junta at the end. Of course, Pinochet was totally in control from about 1977. He'd sidelined all the others for being insufficiently dedicated to his project. But I think her father's, whose name I think was Fernando Matei, was considered to be a fairly moderate and sensible general, but people don't remember that. People remember him being an evil member of the junta. So she may well be disqualified from becoming the president because people still consider that to be
I mean, she did vote yes to Pinochet staying in power, didn't she, in that 1989 referendum, which one would have thought would be the kiss of death, really. I mean, and it just seems slightly odd that she should entertain serious hopes. I mean, you'd have thought that would just put her out of the running. But there it is, she's playing on. And anyway, I really think we must now wrap up any remaining candidates with a sentence each, because I think we've gone on very long.
She might be able to come in, she might be able to wedge her way in. She still hasn't made it clear that she's going to run, but she may well be viable this time. And a lot will depend on how many people vote. So she is a possibility. Now, the final candidate who must be mentioned is José Antonio Cast, who is the uncle of Felipe Cast and is the son of the German immigrant who introduced casual dining to Chile. And he has tried to position himself as a sort of Bolsonaro, the Brazilian Bolsonaro candidate, a tough man, a no-nonsense candidate. But Bolsonaro is, of course, more of a Trump kind of crazy figure. And José Antonio Cast is not crazy. He's actually quite coherent, makes a lot of sense, but is trying to build himself a solid right-wing platform and denounce everyone else for not being properly right-wing.
I see.
That's a position that cannot win you the presidency, but maybe it can be an important power base going forward. So he's worth bearing in mind anyway, because I think he's committed to running in the initial round of the election, and he may well carry, 15% of the vote. It could well happen if there's a low voter turnout. He could have 10 or 15% of the vote and be a real kingmaker, because obviously the people who are going to vote for him are the sort of people who would vote for whoever he says to vote for. Got it. So his vote could go to Evelyn Matei, who would be the next most reliable right-winger from the position of José Antonio Cast. So it's a very interesting dynamic. I'm sorry we've probably spoken for way too long, but this is a fascinating topic, and we'll probably have to break it into smaller bits and talk about different bits that we've alluded to so far.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking to you is always an education, Pete. Your erudition never ceases to dazzle me. I think we'll bring it to an end there. If this isn't too long to put up, but nothing's too long to put up, so what the hell?
There is no such thing.
That's right.
We could always cut it. We could always cut these hot slices into 3 hot takes and put them up separately. I don't know. You're the technological wizard behind all of this, Neil.
Right.
That's quite clear.
Yeah, that's the one. Okay. All right then. Well, thank you for anybody who stayed with us this long, and look forward to seeing you again next time on Chile Talk.
Many thanks. Thanks for listening.